So I just watched a video discussing extremism in the United States military, and I had some thoughts on it. I am a United States Navy veteran. I did 9 years. I was a aviation machinist mate. Basically, I worked on jet engines and fuel systems, on Hornets and Super Hornets. Uh, my father was a hull technician in the Navy, and he was in the Army in Vietnam. My wife is active duty in the Navy. Uh, as far as I can tell from the family history that I know about, my family's got about 250 years and counting of cumulative military service. I'm fairly familiar with the social environment around the military. And And I want to start off by saying that yes, there is a large overlap in the Venn diagram between people who have an interest in the military and people who have an interest in extremist groups. Uh, what we would probably call like right wing nationalist type movements. There is an overlap in those interests. That doesn't mean that there's an overlap between those groups and the military, or at least not as significant a one as some people might think. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that the military recruitment process is fairly selective. Yes, right now recruiting numbers are down, so they're slightly less selective than other times, and that's something that varies. As they need more recruits, they'll relax some standards. As they don't need as many recruits, they'll tighten some standards. It's an ongoing process. But that process does tend to weed out an awful lot of people. Um, you know, your volunteer pool is fairly small in the first place. There's not a huge number of people who are willing to serve in the military at all. Out of that group, there's people who are going to be medically disqualified, mentally disqualified, intellectually disqualified, criminal record disqualified. People are going to disqualify themselves through things like gang or drug tattoos, uh, things like that. There's all kinds of stuff that will prevent somebody from getting in the military and a fairly narrow pathway to get in. So that tends to eliminate an awful lot of the extremists. And then in boot camp, they tend to be fairly sensitive to those kinds of attitudes, pick up on it pretty quickly, and either quote unquote, because it's not real physical beatings, but either beat those attitudes out of people or figure out that they're just not a good fit. So when you hear stories about, militia or extremist group members or whatever, where this is a person who is claiming a military background, but if you actually look at their records, they were only in the military for like a couple or a few months. Those are the people who like didn't make it through boot camp. Those are the people who in boot camp showed themselves to be enough of a problem that despite the already significant investment that the military has made in them, the militaries want to go, you know what, never mind. We don't want you. We don't need you. You're not going to work out here. So a lot of people end up, with these extremist attitudes, end up getting kicked out in boot camp or very shortly thereafter. And that's something that continues throughout the military. Depending on the unit that you end up in, the command that you're in, and the people around you, I mean, people are people. Human beings are human beings, and we all have our own flaws and imperfections and blind spots or biases and sympathies. So if somebody manages to get into the military, get past boot camp, get into the point where they're actually out, in the Navy we call it in the fleet, then as long as they can stay out of trouble, they'll probably be fine. But there are still mechanisms in place to detect and report and deal with problematic attitudes and behaviors. And while you're in the military, while you're actually actively doing your job in the military, you receive ongoing training and imprecations and attitude adjustments about this kind of stuff. But the biggest experience that you'll have while you're actually in is traveling around the world, working with and dealing with people of all kinds of backgrounds, and that process will push an awful lot of the ignorance at the heart of extremism out of people. One of my dad's favorite sayings, and something that I repeat an awful lot, is when the shit hits the fan, there's only two things that matter. Can you do your job? Have you got my back? That's really all you're going to care about in the middle of a tricky situation, whatever it is. You really don't care about the religion or skin color or orientation or gender or whatever about the person next to you, when what matters is, are they watching your back? All the rest of that stuff in that moment just doesn't matter. And once somebody has had the experience of none of that stuff mattering, once they've had the experience of realizing how low priority that kind of stuff actually is in the face of real situations, real moments where you need that person. Okay, you're some kind of white supremacist or something, but the guy next to you, watching your back, helping you out, saving your life and your buddy's life, is a black guy. Yeah, your white supremacist attitudes are gonna need a little bit of adjustment after that. That's the kind of thing that sticks with you and alters your mind. Not for everybody. And you can also have the opposite experience. If you get into a unit where, unfortunately, there are other supremacists or extremists or something like that, and nobody really putting a check on that behavior, then yeah, you can run into a situation where those attitudes kind of get reinforced. Because in that moment, what really matters is that cohesiveness, is that idea of, depending on each other, counting on each other, backing each other up. And that can end up being kind of a bubble. There can be a fair amount of confirmation bias. There can be an awful lot of kind of redoubling of problematic attitudes if you end up with a bad mix of personnel in a unit. So it's an ongoing process. There are an awful lot of factors. The world travel, the exposure to other cultures, working closely with people from different backgrounds, all of that kind of stuff can really help mitigate, a predilection towards these extremist attitudes. But there can also be things that have the opposite effect. Ultimately, though, the military does not condone these attitudes. The military does not promote these attitudes, and the military does combat these attitudes whenever they show up. But the military is a cross section of humanity. And what you actually see, I have heard, I don't know this for a fact, but what you actually apparently see when you look at the number of extremists in the general population and the number of extremists in the military/veteran population, there isn't actually all that much of a discrepancy. The military is not really overrepresented, and the members of these organizations that do have some kind of military experience tend to be representative of kind of the worst the military has to offer. Not always, but the people who end up in these extremist groups, they're people who tend to not have been super successful in the military, despite whatever impression they may try to give about the nature and character of their service. So, ultimately, as a veteran, as a person whose entire life has been in and around the military, I just want to assure people that this is something that, the DoD should be concerned about, should be making every effort to combat, should be making sure that our military members are of the absolute highest caliber. But at the same time, it's not something that I feel people should really be super worried about. Like, this is not something that is, in my experience, really widespread throughout the military. Again, cross section of humanity: good, bad, ugly, everything in between. Uh, you'll find it all. Don't let the worst of that overly influence your impression of our service members, our veterans, our people who volunteer to serve in our armed forces. We're definitely not all heroes. That's a term that gets way overused. But we're also far from being extremists. For the vast majority of us, we're people just doing a job, you know. And in today's world, the military is a pretty damn good deal. Um, and that's kind of it. It's yes, just as in every other aspect of our society, extremism is a problem that should be dealt with. It is a problem that should be dealt with in our military, but there's already an awful lot of mitigating factors that, from my perspective, means you don't really need to worry about it. Yeah, just my view on things, for whatever that's worth.